Good morning. We are here in the Sanford boardroom of the Washington Duke Inn to have a conversation with Joel Fleishman as part of the 50th anniversary of the Sanford School of Public Policy. Joel Fleishman here not only had the vision for the Sanford School, you were also the person who really got it off the ground, founded the institution, and then directed it for its first 13 years of operation. And so we will spend most of our conversation talking about your role with the Institute and watching it grow and develop into the Sanford School. But I thought that we could actually start with one key characteristic that you have, which is that you are well known for bringing people together. I wanted to start us with your early life, and to kind of set that stage, there was a reminiscence from a friend of yours, Robert Kaiser, who described your gatherings in New Haven in a place called George and Harry's. And he said the meeting time was always 11 p.m., and the agenda was always the events of the day, the state of the nation and the world, new ideas of many varieties, and the great liberal experiment. In other words, what we now recognize as the SFA, or Standard Fleishman Agenda. And I think that captures a great deal about you and what your vision has been and what your interests have been throughout your life. And I was wondering if the seeds of the Standard Fleishman Agenda were planted in your childhood, growing up in this Jewish community in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
It's hard to know when seeds were planted because I wasn't sentient at that point. My guess is it probably was planted in my childhood because my parents were much the same way. It just they were very social people. Both of them were leaders in the Jewish community in Fayetteville. My father was the president of the synagogue, and my mother was the founder and head of the sisterhood. It was the rare Friday night that we didn't have guests in for dinner, for Shabbat dinner. And when I was growing up, when the Second World War was going on, and so there were a lot of soldiers coming to Fayetteville, some of them Jewish. And in fact, we used to the synagogue put up a large tent in the yard adjacent to the synagogue for the additional services. So there would be a couple hundred people there, and many of them came to dinner at our home after the services. So it was just, I guess, so I observed that my parents got great satisfaction out of bringing people together, and I continued that. And so it just happens, and I still do it, and 85 years later.
Was there something about your experience growing up that made you very interested in what was the aspect of the Standard Fleishman Agenda, which was the great liberal experiment of America and what it was trying to do?
When I was growing up, many of the same issues that are plaguing the country at this point, except in a much more divisive and unpleasant way, were there. And so, I remember, I think I was in high school when Dr. Frank Graham ran for the U.S. Senate. Mm-hmm. And when that terrible Jesse Helms faked photographs of a variety of sorts of the people working with him did to try to tar him with being a lover of black people. They even went so far as to fake a photograph of Dr. Frank dancing with a black woman. Totally, fiction. Not that he wouldn't, but the fact of the matter is he hadn't, and at least not for the purposes of photography. So I was very interested in the Frank Graham campaign, and did not, and worked a little bit at it, but not much. And that continued all through my undergraduate years at Chapel Hill, where, unlike today in most college campuses, there was a liberal and a conservative student political party. And so I was very active in what was called the student party as opposed to the conservative party over there. And we were very active in desegregation efforts. This is all about the time I was an undergraduate when the Supreme Court made its decision about desegregation in education. So I was very keenly interested in the subject and worked on those issues when I was at Chapel Hill. And that continued, and it continues even now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you say, you were very involved in the student union there at Chapel Hill, and you not only got your undergraduate degree, but you got a law degree as well as a master's degree in drama while you were there at the University of North
Drama
Carolina.
helps everything.
After graduating, you left for Yale, where you pursued some additional legal training.
True.
And then a friend of yours, Tom Lambeth, twisted your arm to come back to North Carolina, first to help on the Terry Sanford campaign for governor in 1960, and then to come back as a legal assistant to Terry Sanford.
That was a result of my twisting his arm to work for Terry Sanford when he was running for governor, and which he did, and which he did successfully. And both of us ended up being in the governor's office. Tom Lambeth being the governor's administrative assistant, he was in charge of the front door, and I was a legal assistant, and I was in charge of the back door.
I've heard it said that it was a lot easier to get in through your door if you knew you than it was to get in through Tom's door.
That's probably true. That's because I knew many of the people who knew enough to come to the back door.
I was wondering if your experience working either in the campaign or with the Terry Sanford administration, if that shaped any of your vision for what public policy analysis or what this field of public policy could or should be.
Well, it certainly did. It in many ways. I learned a lot from my first job when I came down from Yale in the summer of 1960 to work in the second primary campaign. My job was to be the assistant to Burt Bennett. Burt Bennett was Terry Sanford's campaign manager, and Burt Bennett was just one of the great politicians of the age, very successful businessman in North Carolina. He started a company called Quality Oil, which is one of the large distributors of petroleum in North Carolina. And I learned a great deal from Burt Bennett, in large part because Burt was a stern taskmaster, and he taught me lots of lessons that have been useful. The one that has stuck with me is when people ask you to do something for them, tell them whether you're going to do it or not, and always get back to them, especially if the answer is no.
That does sound like a very good lesson. You kept trying to tell Terry no when it came to working for Terry.
Well, that's true. I mean, because I was very happy in my work, in my life at Yale. It's just a perfect situation with living in an apartment in residential colleges, and I couldn't imagine anything better. When I was faced with that offer, I decided I would have a conversation with the dean of the Yale Law School about whether I should do it. And many graduates of Yale go to work in Washington, as many graduates of other universities do. And we had a conversation. He said you'd be a damn fool if you did not take the offer. He said it has the potential of really changing your career in beneficial ways. And of course, so I ended up taking the offer and coming down to work in the campaign and work in the governor's office when Terry Sanford was elected. It's been I learned a great deal from him, and it has certainly influenced my campaign because a lot of the things I did for him are things that I'm still doing, and working with foundations to help raise money to do good things, and or advising foundations about things that they might consider doing that are good things. So it was accompanying Terry to when he was trying to raise money for the North Carolina School of the Arts. Was one of the things that I did. Went with him to the Ford Foundation to raise the money, and just observing the way he dealt with them. I mean, when he arrived at the meeting at the Ford Foundation, he said, I don't remember whether Mac Bundy was the president of the Ford Foundation was at the meeting, but the vice president who in charge of the arts was in that meeting, McNeil Lowry, and Terry Sanford started up by saying, Mr. Lowry, we're here not because we want you to give us any money. We're here because we want to get your advice. And of course, by the time the conversation ended, they had gotten our advice and we had gotten their money. But it was wonderful, and that's the way Terry operated.
It sounds like you learned a lot of lessons from Terry, but then you went back to New Haven after the end of the administration.
He finished his term as governor, and what was I to do? I naturally sort of bounded back to my previous circumstances, which I liked a great deal, and I ended up doing that, as you say. I went back to Yale, and in that particular case, working with Kingman Brewster, who was then the president of Yale, and trying to figure out how to, picking up the same theme we were talking about earlier. My mission there really was to try to develop academic programs to facilitate African Americans getting the kind of education and training that they needed. At first through the Yale Summer High School, which I directed, and then later through the Harvard, Yale, Columbia Summer Intensive Studies program that I created, and drew both Harvard and Columbia into, which continued for some years in identifying African American students in predominantly black colleges for special training that would equip them better for graduate studies or PhD studies, or law studies or business studies, whatever. Mm-hmm. And that's what I did. So I continued on that. But in terms of that led to the second major chapter in my work at Yale, which was to help figure out how to start what was then called the School of Management there. And I was the person who helped develop the program for that school, which was designed to train people for public positions, nonprofit positions, and business positions. I told the president that I thought it was a bad idea, frankly, to combine all three goals, because I felt that they could never be very good at one of them if they tried to serve all those constituencies. But he was faced with the problem that the alumni wanted to have a business school, the faculty wanted to have an academic program, and Kingman Brewster wanted to have a program to train government people. Mm. And so I was in the middle of working on that, and I'd done a lot of studies for the Ford Foundation, writing two major reports on education and training for public service, so that when Terry Sanford later, and starting really in 1970, after he was elected president of Duke, began conversations with me about how Duke might do something along the public policy lines. I was really prepared for it, because I interviewed everybody in the country in the schools of public policy, the new schools of public policy, which were being created starting in 1967, and wrote those reports. And so I had clear views about how to do what I think Terry Sanford wanted to do. He then asked me if I would come down, and I said, no, I won't, because I like Yale too much. I'm very happy here. And his response was, well, don't come to Duke then, but just come down and tell us what to do. And so that was a good strategy for him, and it's proven to be a good strategy for me, because I did come down and I did write a report, and then submitted it to him and his other officers at Duke. Ken Pye, who was in the chancellor, and Terry Sanford, and they said, I recommended what they should do. They said, well, after they looked at the report, they called me up in New Haven and said, what you propose to do is exactly what we want to do. Why don't you come down and run it? And so I had to face another agonizing decision at that point about whether I wanted to do it or not. And ultimately, on George Washington's birthday in 1971, I called up Terry Sanford and said, okay, I'll do it. And I've been here ever since.
I wanted to circle back to some of those Ford Foundation reports that you did. You interviewed a lot of people, more than 150 people it looked like, as I was counting in the appendix. It's more than 300 pages for one of the reports, Education and Training for Public Policy Making, a program strategy paper for the Ford Foundation. And I was wondering, how did they come to tap you to be the consultant to do that work?
I have no idea. I was doing consulting for Ford when I was at New Haven, primarily because of the fact that having gotten introduced to the Ford Foundation because of my work for Terry Sanford, they must have thought there was something I could do that would be beneficial to them, and they asked me. So I did something which I still laugh about. One of the first projects they gave me was to write an evaluation of the Ford Foundation's evaluation program, which I did. they had the National Affairs Division of the Ford Foundation was the only, evaluation in foundations is now a big thing, much more frequently spoken of than actually done. But in the case of the Ford Foundation, the only part of the Ford Foundation that had an evaluation program was the National Affairs Program, which dealt with a variety of issues dealing with public policy, one sort or another. And so that's what I started with them. And I think when they were trying to figure out what to do, they created actually a program at the Ford Foundation on public policy. And they were trying to figure out exactly what they should try to do. And that's when they commissioned those two reports, and which I then set on. As I said, the public policy movement as we know it was just beginning to sprout at that point. There'd been groups of faculty members at Harvard starting to work on it probably since about 1965. There were faculty members working at the University of Michigan, which ultimately produced their public policy program, Berkeley, and a number of other places. In any event, so there were already programs in the works, and by 1967, when I was in full flower of my new second chapter at Yale, Harvard, Berkeley, and Michigan had both started this new public policy program in each place, and it was very different. Public policy analysis was a major departure from the field of public administration in the sense that it brought into the training for public policy positions people who had a great deal of understanding as faculty members and students on microeconomics, macroeconomics, statistics, decision analysis, all the kinds of things that help one make make a decision about problems, whether it's public or private, that would be useful to them in their lives. These were schools that are already underway with curricula like that, and so talking to the people who had built those schools, which is what I did, faculty members, and talking to people at Yale who knew things about training for public policy, made it easy for me to try to formulate a set of recommendations, which I think, I've shared that report now, I don't know how many times with people. I never have published it as a book because I just never got around to doing it. But it continues to be one that is read by people who are starting academic programs as well as people in foundations are interested in doing things like that.
Do you think that if Terry Sanford had not asked you to come down to Duke to start the Institute of Policy Sciences and Public Affairs here at Duke, that you would have done something similar at Yale, whether it's incorporating a lot of the ideas that you were coming across and trying to build them into the School of Management, or building up the Institute of Social Sciences there into something like this?
Well, I think the answer is I likely, if he hadn't asked me to do this, I would probably still be at Yale. And because, as once I began working on this, Yale decided it needed to do something. It didn't have a school of public policy. It didn't have a business school, and it didn't have a school of an Institute of Social Science. The Institute of Social Science and the School of Management were two of the outcomes of the work that I was doing there to help Yale figure out what it might do. And so the likelihood is that I would still be there because it was a very happy environment. But as I've told you before and reflected on it, my affinity for North Carolina, which is where I was born and where I grew up, was very strong, and so it was hard for me to say no when the offer came, because I did know a lot about the field that they were wanting to do something in. I did feel that I could make a difference in helping them do it, and so it would have been unlikely for me to have turned it down if the offer came. And so as I reflect on it, the answer is, it certainly was the right decision for me in terms of what I've ended up wanting to do.
Just to follow up on that, and you even said this in your letter that you wrote to Terry Sanford when he was starting this process of trying to get you to come down. you told him that you would not consider leaving New Haven but for the attractiveness of working with you and for the responsibility I feel to serve my state and region. And I'm just wondering, why did you feel this responsibility to serve your state and region?
I grew up here in a time when many people, most of my friends, thought that North Carolina was the best place to be in the country. And some of them, are still around, and they're still doing what they were doing before, which is basically trying to make the world a better place in North Carolina. Tom Lamp is a very good example of that. I mean, he has been president of or executive director of the C. Smith Reynolds Foundation, which is the largest general purpose foundation in North Carolina. He was, I think, the head of that for 25 years. He has been, very active in politics. Worked for Terry Sanford. Worked for a number of liberal candidates for public office, and I shared those same loyalties. I'm not as vocal about them as I was because people confuse a loyalty to North Carolina with a loyalty to the University of North Carolina. And since, while I did go to the University of North Carolina, I've worked at Duke for 50 years. I've spent many more years at Duke than I did at Chapel Hill. Had the argument last night at dinner, as a matter of fact. And people said, how can I possibly be a supporter of Duke? When I went to Chapel Hill, I said, well, I have worked there for 50 years, and I do have an affinity for Duke, but that doesn't in any way diminish, my loyalty to North Carolina. It may water down. I always cheer for Chapel Hill when they're not playing Duke, and I always cheer for Duke when they are playing North Carolina. But my experience with Terry Sanford, who was a charismatic figure, who had outrageous ambitions for everything, including the state of North Carolina and later for Duke University, they reinforced my own commitments and my own values about, I still have a very soft spot for North Carolina. And when I see the problems that North Carolina has had politically over the course of the last decade, I'm all the more convinced, and that's one of the reasons I've really thrown myself into the efforts to right the balance here in North Carolina, which actually means righting the left in North Carolina rather than righting the right, given the problems that the right has created in North Carolina and continues to create.
You mentioned that that very famous Frank Porter Graham race for the Senate. 1950. And he was also the longtime president at the University of North Carolina.
He was.
And I wondered, was he an example and a role model in those sorts to you?
Absolutely. Well, this guy was about as selfless as any human being I've ever met. He was a mighty giant, not much taller than you are. As president of the University of North Carolina, he did more to create, he and his cousin, Edward Kidder Graham, who was also president of the University of North Carolina, did more to establish the reputation of the University of North Carolina system as a liberal institution that respected the role that African Americans have played in North Carolina history, and the importance of North Carolina's creating an environment that would be fair to all its citizens, whatever their color. And he wrote no books, curiously enough, but he gave many speeches, and many of them, the speeches are still quoted by people. I knew him. He definitely was one of the giants of the period in which when I was at Chapel Hill as an undergraduate, and even before going to Chapel Hill. I mean, my parents were very supportive of Frank Graham when he ran, and unfortunately didn't win. And in a race that Jesse Helms played an inordinate influence and an unfair influence on.
So back to coming to Duke and founding the Institute of, and this is what you originally entitled it. And I've heard you say that maybe you regret in some ways the kind of cumbersome phrasing here, but the Institute of Policy Sciences and Public Affairs.
Yeah, well, it was an infelicitous name. Nobody knew what it meant. Basically, I was trying to give credit to Harold Lasswell, who was a distinguished political theorist who taught at the Yale Law School and who coined the idea of the policy sciences. Nobody else thinks that, virtually nobody else thinks that policy is is a science. And therefore, the notion that the policy sciences she coined, I thought I was just really trying to recognize his contribution, but it's one of those things that just didn't take. And after I proclaimed that was the name of it, many people said, well, why in the world would you choose that name? By that time, people were already thinking in terms of public policy analysis and public policy studies. And so I didn't wage any kind of battle to retain it. I figured that's not important. What's important is what we do. And since all the other places were called schools of public policy or schools of public policy analysis, I wasn't going to fight what was clearly a losing battle.
Well, so you had done this survey for the Ford Foundation of all of these other programs and schools of public policy. But one characteristic that was very key to what you established here was that it had this emphasis on undergraduate education.
Correct.
Which was a distinction among all these other programs. How did you end up landing on that, undergraduate education as a key emphasis?
Well, there were two reasons. One is Terry Sanford cared more about the undergraduates, which showed, of course, during his period when he was the students at the football games and basketball games always referred to him as Uncle Terry. And they had cheers for Uncle Terry because they appreciated the fact that Terry Sanford really cared about undergraduate education. Now the truth of the matter is the people who founded Duke cared about undergraduate education. Duke, in its founding, was a liberal arts men's college, which ultimately became a liberal arts co-ed college, very early, actually, in the 20th century. As a liberal arts college, Duke had a tradition of being focused on the quality of teaching. As a university, it kept that commitment all through in building the rest of the university. Terry's commitment to undergraduates showed itself in, for example, probably the first building he was responsible for raising the money for and building is the Bryan Center, which is basically a student center. Mm-hmm. And faculty members would have preferred, they were not in favor of that. By and large, they wanted to put whatever money he raised into raising faculty salaries and mm-hmm. and scholarships and fellowships. He did all those too, but the building is still there, and it has become the center for student life. So that's the ideological commitment. There was another reason for doing it, and that was it was a lot less costly to Duke to focus on undergraduate education for the Sanford, became the Sanford School, because it was easier to raise the money. And so part of the bargain that Terry Sanford struck with me was that I had to raise the money to start what's now the Sanford School. And as we actually started creating courses, and ultimately an undergraduate major, and ultimately a master's in public policy, and now ultimately a PhD, the students would come, enroll in our classes, which they did, and they continue to do, and then the university could build the cost of that program and ultimately the school into the hard money budget. Mm. As a way of getting the program going at the least possible cost, that was the way we chose it. So, which was more dominant in Terry's mind, I don't know. But the fact that he cared a lot about undergraduate showed, the way in which he dealt with the students when he was here. Famous story about Terry Sanford, he basically took office, right in the middle of a dispute between the students and the administration and trustees over policy issues regarding compensation for Duke staff. Mm-hmm. And there was a famous demonstration out in the center of the campus in front of the chapel and in front of the statue of James Buchanan Duke when Terry actually took office. And he came out there, strode out there with a bullhorn and said to the students, "I hear you're trying to take over the Allen Building. Well, why struggle? Just follow me." And he led them to his office, which it gives you some sense of how smart he was and how empathetic he was. And this wasn't simply show, because if you look at the 15 years that Terry Sanford was president of Duke, he did a great deal. People will say in the future that Terry Sanford really did put undergraduate education at Duke ahead of everything else during his presidency, which is true. Everything from the building of the Bryan Center to simply the focus on undergraduate education as being what Duke should excel in. The first meeting that I attended after coming down here, a meeting in Terry Sanford's office in 1971, and Terry Sanford was concerned about the fact that Duke was not a well-known institution outside of North Carolina and the Midwest in the U.S. And so he said, I think we need to figure out some way to reach public consciousness. And he said, I've come to the conclusion that the best way to do this is for us basically to buy a full-color supplement in the New York Times Sunday magazine with pictures of Duke faculty members and descriptions of the program here and why it's such a great place. And all of us around the table, to a person, said, we can't do that. That's very tacky. Good schools don't do that. And Terry Sanford said, well, we're going to do it. And at the princely sum of $25,000 then for buying that full-color supplement, we bought the supplement. And it really is quite an impressive, persuasive work. That was in 1971. Fast forward to 1985, when Terry Sanford was about to leave Duke, the New York Times Sunday magazine had a picture on the cover of the magazine of the Duke Chapel with photos of Duke students, two undergraduates, playing Frisbee in front of it. And the feature article in it with bold letters at the bottom of the front cover was Duke, the hot college. So, in a sense, it encapsulates what Terry tried to do during that period of time. And those are the reasons that we started with the undergraduate. It happens that there was only one other quasi-public policy program in the country that had an undergraduate program, which was Princeton. It really wasn't analogous because they didn't use the same intellectual model. It was not based on microeconomics and statistics and decision analysis and all of those kinds of things that gave credibility to public policy analysis truly understood. It was a traditional international affairs program, but Duke's was the first, and I have to say that others have followed suit. Harvard is still talking. They haven't done it yet. They don't have an undergraduate major. They do offer courses at Kennedy School to undergraduates. They could enroll in some of the graduate courses, but they keep talking about the desirability of having an undergraduate major, but they've never yet had the guts to do it. Many other schools have followed suit and do have it.
A lot of what you were doing for the Ford Foundation was trying to figure out how to improve government service in the long run. But was that part of your vision that these undergraduates would go out and improve public service, or was that kind of ancillary to any of your other goals that you might have had?
It was not me choosing the goals. It was Terry Sanford. Mm-hmm. And Terry Sanford, if you go back and read his inaugural address at Duke, he talked about the importance of training undergraduates to go into government service and to go into primarily government service. And he was thinking about politics. We're still fighting that battle in a sense. If you look at the midterm elections in 2018, the great achievement has been basically the surfacing of new young talent running for public office. Many of those people had not been born when Terry Sanford was president of Duke, and yet that was his mission. He understood, and it was a mission that he tried to carry out when he was governor. And if the subsequent governors, Jim Hunt certainly shared that mission and did a lot to bring along oncoming generations of possible candidates. I'm sorry to say that I think that the two other governors after Jim Hunt didn't do that, and it's one of the reasons that the Democratic Party got into such problems during the period of Republican ascendancy starting in 2010. But the fact of the matter is, it was what we saw in terms of the outpouring of new candidates, not just in North Carolina, but all over the country. Many women running for office for the first time. But Terry Sanford saw the need for that. And that's why, if you read his inaugural address, That's why he gave as one of the three major goals of his administration the creation of a program at Duke that would train young people to go into politics and to go into government. It was his strong belief. I did not see it as clearly as he did, but I agreed with it, but I didn't see it in the same way that he did. He saw the need there, and he from the outside, and it's why ultimately he gave such strong support to the creation of what is now the Sanford School.
So in your founding of this place, one of the key things you did, besides kind of set up some of these structures, was in hiring and making the right hires. And it seems like you were especially focused on hiring people who were great scholars, but also great teachers. How did you go about hiring that first set of kind of founding faculty? Willis Hawley, Bruce Payne, Phil Cook, Jim Vopel.
Virtually all of the people whose names you just mentioned were teaching at other institutions. And they were young in their careers at those institutions. And I came to know them in the course of the work I did for the Ford Foundation. And my sense was that they had the excitement and the commitment to undergraduate teaching that would stand Duke in good stead. There's a famous, I think not very well known report that the Ford Foundation program officer in charge of its program on public policy that Ford created sent back after visiting Duke. What he said in the report was, to be a faculty member at Duke, you have to be a very good scholar. To be a faculty member in the Sanford School of Public Policy, you have to be a very good teacher as well as a good scholar. And of course, that has shown itself. If you compare over the years of the existence of the Sanford School, you'll find that we are now rated in terms of the productivity of our scholars, the research productivity of our scholars. We are rated as at almost, I think, at the top of all the schools of public policy. These are faculty members but they also have probably the largest number of awards that Duke gives for very good teaching of any department at Duke. Adding the dimension in there about the quality of teaching, which Duke, I think, believes in its heart is important, and certainly its history as an undergraduate liberal arts college suggested it did. Duke, as a university, had a commitment to undergraduate teaching too. So it was not going against the grain for us basically to insist that persons who come here be rated not only on their the research capacities, but also on their ability to teach and to convey it. When you think about the public policy school is 50 years old. It's not as old as any other department at Duke. And yet, for the last, I think, 10 to 20 years, among the number of undergraduates who've majored in public policy, either as a first major or a combined major, has always placed the Sanford School first or second at Duke University in terms of the numbers. And that despite the fact that the undergraduate major is the most rigorous. If you count up the number of required courses that undergraduates have to take to major in public policy, it is in the social sciences. It's certainly as harder than any of the other departments.
Hardy McLean, who was one of the first graduates of the public policy undergraduate program, said that PPS classes were renowned for both their intellectual rigor and voluminous reading lists. And so it seems like early on, the Institute had a reputation for the rigor of its program.
And it still does. It just still does. I think my course has a syllabus that's something like 62 pages.
So there is a side of the Institute that was very heavily focused on these quantitative research methods for public policy. So some of those decision-making tools, cost-benefit analysis, was a major statistics. But there was also a strand that you injected into the Institute that there was a strand of ethics, and there was a strong dose of the humanities that was also a part of that, which I think also is a bit reflective of you as a person, someone who values both of those things.
Absolutely,
and
I do.
What was your decision-making like in terms of how to do that and then why to do that?
Anybody who thinks that numbers, that numeracy is the main ingredient in good decisions hasn't thought carefully enough about that. Numeracy that is being able to measure the consequences of what you're doing or what you're proposing to do typically is really important, because it's a major ingredient of recognizing that you have to care about the consequences of what you're doing when you're spending public money, or whether you're spending time to require students to do things. All the other public policy programs put a very high emphasis on quantitative tools. And we also put high emphasis on quantitative tools, but at the same time, I believe strongly that the humanistic side, that is history, biography, and other humanistic fields, are exceedingly important in enabling people who know how to count to get some understanding of what it is important to count. If I try to remember Albert Einstein's famous quotation, I am going to muddle it somehow. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. I got it right, I think, pretty much. It's really important for people to understand the need to count, but it's also important for people to understand that not everything you can count really does count. This argument continues to surface in the field of among foundation decision making today, the field that I follow. People want to say, well, if you focus on only the things that you can count, you're not going to do some important things that you should do as a foundation. But if you don't focus on the things that count, you're not going to know whether anything that you've done really is making a difference. The mark of an intelligent mind is the capacity to hold within it two opposite, conflicting points of view and balance them. Harvard has always had at least an ethics module in its public policy program, and Yale did, once we started the School of Management, did too. We actually went then one better by requiring an ethics course at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level, several different courses taught differently. David Price, longtime congressman from this area, came here from Yale specifically to help design the ethics course, and he's actually written books on that subject. We've had required courses at the undergraduate level and graduate level on ethics. Bruce Payne wrote very attractive courses to students on humanistic perspectives on public policy. Basically, anybody who reads books of history about presidents, I've just been going through a number of them within the last 6 months, that are really wonderful. Michael Beschloss's new book on presidents, called Presidents of War, in which he describes the roles that different aspects of knowledge influenced the presidents in their decisions about whether to undertake a war and how to wage the war. And presidents differ. And it's a chapter on each president of the United States and the wars that they fought. And it is gripping reading, and everybody who wants to understand how to make decisions and the influence of ethics and knowledge, and humanistic knowledge particularly, need to read books like that. We had that course that Bruce started, and we've had other faculty members. We have historians on the faculty. Bruce Cunningham, who was the first dean of the Sanford School, is a historian. His teaching is illuminated by his knowledge of history. Because if you don't know what the history of dealing with a problem is, you're not going to make good decisions in the present. If you think about the basic framework of public policy analysis, it is quantitative, but it's not the only thing. One of the things I'm proudest of was our decision to bring Alex Harris here. Alex Harris is was a documentary photographer, still is. He's the one who founded Duke Center for Documentary Studies. He's the one who taught the course, which is now not just documentary photography, but documentary history and documentary literature. And the reason for our doing that was basically because it's just very important for students whose primary training is in microeconomics, statistics, and decision analysis, understand the human dimensions of public policy. Because after all, human beings are either the beneficiaries or the victims of public policy, too often the latter and not the former. And it's just absolutely essential for students to understand that microeconomic statistics and decision analysis are not the only ways of measuring the consequences of things. You need both.
Well, I wanted to pick back up with one key feature that relates to what you were just mentioning about injecting the humanities and ethics and understanding the values and moving beyond just the numbers, which is this experiential component
Yes.
Of the Sanford Institute.
Yes.
This focus on having the internship being a real core feature of what the major would be,
Right.
something that I think has really set the stage for so much of what undergraduate education period has become, but including at Duke, this emphasis on internships is something that students do
Right.
that relates to their curriculum and is not just separate from their curriculum.
I came to Duke having been at Yale, where we developed courses that included internships, creating courses for undergraduates that married experience in the real world with academic work in the classroom proved to be a very important component of it. We created a number of substantive policy courses, such as international trade policy, education policy, criminal justice policy. We had a double major in engineering and public policy. And the communications, the Center for now called the Media and Democracy, was always also a very important point because it's actually grown considerably. We had those courses in media as well. We envisioned them and ran them for the first, 10 years as basically a year-long sequence where a student would take an introductory course in a field. I felt that it had to be field-based because otherwise it could get to be very vague.
Mm-hmm.
But field-based students who would take a course, for example, in communications in the spring semester, and we would arrange an internship with select institutions, media institutions, in the summertime, usually in Washington or New York, and then a follow-up course back in the classroom at Duke. The internship was accompanied by an informal seminar taught by one of our faculty members wherever the students happened to be. So it was a continuous year-long experience which married classroom work with working in organizations that were dealing with the problems the course dealt with. And those courses were very successful. We still provide internships. We raised money to supplement student stipends so that they can actually be paid for the internships. But we didn't continue the model of having them year-long courses. But typically what happens is the students will take either a spring semester on that field, in the field of their internship, or a follow-up course in the fall, but not both. The important thing is to get experience, give the students experience in dealing with the realities of the problems that they're interested in, at the same time that they get good academic foundations in how to think about and how to have the tools to work with the problems in the field.
Mm-hmm. How did you make those choices about what areas of specialty that you would offer? Did that just depend a little bit on who you hired and who the faculty were that had their expertise?
Yeah, it was opportunistic in a sense. Typically, good faculty members cared about the involvement of their students in the world of affairs. And if you think about the MPP program at this point now requires every MPP student to have a client in the real world for whom they're actually doing their master's paper. In a sense, it is another attempt to marry real world experience with academic training. And that's still the case. We try to find what students are interested in, and then we go out of our way to help the students figure out and to arrange for internships for them. And it is, I think it's, again, one of the reasons that the major is as popular as it is, because the students like to have internships, and anything you can do to help them arrange them is all for the better, and it makes it even more attractive.
What were you trying to do with the master's program then, which was much more oriented to be a joint program, as I understand it, with other departments?
Not at the beginning. It wasn't as much of a joint program. It has become more of a joint program because I think that the students in the master's program wanted to get a deeper training in specific fields like economics or like political science. At the beginning, it was a solo program, but the development of disciplinary additional focuses of the master's program is a feature of probably starting about 3 or 4 years ago, and it's gradually there are more of them now than ever, and it's proven to be popular. The students can't get too much economics. They can't get too much political science, because economics and political science are the heart of so many of the public policy problems that people have to deal with. And so if the major focus of the MPP program is providing the tools and the theory, it helps to have them also have access to things that are deeper in economics and politics, if that's what they want to spend their time on. It's proven to be a popular thing to do, and that's something I can't take the credit for because I didn't think about it.
After 13 years running the Institute, your arm was twisted once again by Terry Sanford to take on the Capitol campaign. But you had many other opportunities before that to do other things, as I understand it. Why did you remain at Duke rather than taking some of these other opportunities, whether it was become president at Brandeis or maybe some other position in government or other fields?
I like to think that I had the good sense not to be seduced by offers that sound attractive, but which require a lot of effort on my part to do things that I'm really not interested in. And I've avoided taking positions. Brandeis, the presidency of Brandeis was a good example. I wasn't sure that I wanted to be considered for the presidency of Brandeis, but I have very strong Jewish roots, and Brandeis was an institution that needed a good president. I was very open-minded about it, and when I thought about, after having been offered the job, I was 2 years from the ending of the Capitol campaign as a success, and I did not want to leave Duke after having run a campaign that I undertook in part because Duke had never had a successful Capitol campaign before then, and to leave Duke at the point before this one was completed. And I wouldn't want it to be another failed campaign. I've never been attracted by the idea of being president of anything because I know what presidents have to go through. I mean, they are at everybody's command. Anybody makes claims on them has to be weighed. And I, having been an academic who does pretty much what he wants to do over the years, did not want to subject myself to a bunch of claims from people that typically are not along the lines of what I care about. It's hard to turn down a university presidency, particularly one that where the institution is working in fields that I care a lot about. But nonetheless, it was the right thing for me to do.
Did you feel like the Institute was going to be in good hands as you made the decision to join the Capitol campaign?
Yeah, no, I never had any doubt about the capacity. But it is a school that has retained the people. Very few people actually whom I recruited left until they were ready to retire. They've gone on recruiting a group of young people who are absolutely terrific. They're great teachers, and they're also great scholars. They all publish books that are rated, and they all get promoted. The leadership is there. I have every confidence that it will continue.
So as you were running the Capitol campaign, and then later as you became the president of Atlantic Philanthropies, I don't remember your title as president, did you have a strong hand in still continuing to guide or shape the Institute as it became the Sanford Institute and then the Sanford School? Did people come to you to ask for advice? What role were you playing during that?
I felt anybody who has ever been the head of an institution, whatever it is, steps aside from doing that, feels a natural reluctance to get involved in decisions afterwards. So, and I felt exactly the same way. As I said earlier, the people who succeeded me in running what is now the Sanford School were people in whom I had great confidence, and I did not want in any way to undercut their effectiveness by getting involved. So I stopped going to faculty meetings by and large because I didn't want to have to take stands on issues that others had made, decisions on others had made, because I should leave that to others. And it is still the case. I will go if there's a particular reason for me to go, and other members of the faculty would like to have me there for making a decision, which has happened maybe only 2 or 3 times, I've been willing to do it. But nonetheless, I've avoided doing that. The future belongs to the people there, not me. And I don't want to complicate their lives in any way beyond what they'd like me to do.
Were you very involved in raising the money to build the new building? Because one of the big transitions the school went to was from this old, dingy, asbestos-filled old building in Old Kim to the shiny, bright, amazing new building. Maybe that's just folklore, but
the answer is yes. I did help with raising the money for it.
I've understood that there was a moment where it seemed like the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy might end up in some other portion of the university, and that you fought hard to keep it in the Sanford school.
It's not that I know of. We did, in fact, start what is now the Center for Health Policy in the Sanford School, and it got so big because of the faculty people we recruited for it, for the directorship and others, that we ended up spinning that off because it got to be outsized compared to the rest of the efforts in the Sanford School. And so it's still at Duke, but it is really more under the auspices of the Fuqua School, because a lot of the people who were interested in the degrees that qualified people to work in hospitals and managed care organizations also wanted an MBA. But that's the only example that I know of something that Sanford started, which ended up being too big, and basically spinning it off.
One of the major centers at the Sanford School is the DeWitt Wallace Center for Democracy and Media Studies. Why did that become such a core focus? Why was that something that was important to you to have as part of? There was something that was focused on journalism, that was focused on the media, that was focused on this aspect of public policy, to be part of a public policy program. 3
reasons. The first reason is one of necessity. We believed that media, an understanding of the media and an understanding of how the media works were very important to anybody working in the field of public policy, scholars as well as practitioners. It's now evident, much clearer now than it was when we made that decision in the early 1970s, that would be the case. But it is now clear to everybody, given the development of social media, given the 24/7 typical news hour schedule, and all the other ways in which the media have been affecting public policy and public management. So that was never really an issue. We started that right from the very beginning, but it is also the case that we had some happenings that were totally unanticipated. The first of which was the decision by Gene Patterson, who had been the Pulitzer Prize-winning editor of the Atlanta Journal, or maybe it was the Constitution, to leave. He had then gone from being the editor in Atlanta to being the managing editor of the Washington Post, and he decided after being a year at the Washington Post that it was not easy to work with the folks that be there, and so he actually approached us. He came down. He had great admiration for Terry Sanford, and he came down to talk with Terry, and Terry put him in touch with me, and it was clear that he wanted to, if we had a position for him, that he would come here. So we appointed him, Gene Patterson, as a practitioner professor of the practice. May have been the first, I don't remember, at Sanford, to teach courses on the media and public policy. Gene was here for a year, and Professor James David Barber, who was at one point the chairman of the Department of Political Science at Duke, and whom I'd helped recruit from Yale to come to Duke, was very keen on the media, and he and Bill Green, who was the vice president of Duke for Public Affairs, began to work on the development of a program called the Duke Fellows in Communications Policy, which identified a number of distinguished reporters and editors from the print media and from the electronic media at that point to participate in regular sessions at Duke. They came down actually 4 times a year, and it included most of the people, whose names everybody knows. You'd be hard put to name a famous journalist who was not participating in that program. That's not my doing. It was Bill Green's doing and Dave Barber's doing. The idea of having a media component of the Sanford School was there from the beginning, but it took the fortuitous event of Gene Patterson, who is on anybody's list as one of the really great editors of our times, to want to come to Duke. I mean, out of the blue, he had no connection with. He ended up loving Duke, and I think his grandchildren came to Duke, if I remember correctly. But in any event, and then of course, when we got into the starting the Capitol campaign, starting in 1983, it was clear that there was a Duke alumnus who was the head of the Reader's Digest. He was the head of the foundation, actually, too, that the Reader's Digest started up. His name was George Groon. He happened to have been an alumnus of Duke. And so being an alumnus of Duke made him a candidate for a possible gift from Duke. And so we approached George Groon for a gift to create what is now the Center for Media and Democracy. And that has been the basic endowment that came from the Reader's Digest for that center. And the people who've been the director of that center have had their salaries paid from the income on that endowment. So it may be the only part of the Sanford School at this point that has an independent endowment, but it has been really important to attracting to Duke young people who are interested in the media. Duke did not have and doesn't want a school of journalism. What we wanted is a department that studied the media and decision-making of the media and prepared students for jobs in the media that would make a real difference in their careers, that without everything else that goes with a school of communications. And so they don't get a degree in communications, they get a certificate in media and democracy as part of their undergraduate work or as their master's work if they want to do that. So it's been a very important part of the Sanford School, and as I said, for a lot of reasons it happened just as a matter of good fortune from the field, because Terry Sanford was here and a distinguished editor wanted to come here and work with Terry Sanford because he couldn't get along with his bosses at the Washington Post.
Another program that started after you stepped down as director was the Heart Leadership Program.
Yes.
But that's been something that has been another important pillar of the Sanford School.
It's the same kind of thing. It was a fortuitous happening because it started with the Capitol campaign, and there was a Duke trustee by the name of Millage Hart from Dallas, Texas, he was actually the first person I identified to ask for $1 million gift in the Capitol campaign. And I remember how anxious I was when I approached him. It was the first time I'd ever asked anybody for $1 million over dinner. And I have to say, right away he said yes. So I began to be able to relax and enjoy the wine at dinner. Bruce Payne, who was really the spark plug in the Heart Leadership Program, he's the one that we said earlier had started the course in humanities and public policy, as well as teaching the ethics course in public policy as well. He's the one actually saw what a leadership program could be. Bruce, I think, was the first director of the Heart Leadership Program and has continued to be a mentor there, but every one of the directors has really been terrific. The Heart Leadership Program was such an exceptional program, having nothing to do with me, having to do with Bruce Payne and the others who taught in it and the students who were attracted to it. that John Gardner, who wrote books on leadership, he called the Heart Leadership Program the single best leadership program in any liberal arts university in the country. And it's again because of the multifaceted ways, the multifaceted subjects that they dealt with. Because, keep in mind that Bruce Payne, who started our work in humanistic perspectives, was the architect of the Heart Leadership Program. And so some of the courses were courses dealing with humanities, with ethics, with biography, with history, and it was that I think gave that program the real boost, and at a time when students were beginning to get involved in off-campus work. Now everybody goes abroad at some point. It's the new thing, but it wasn't the new things when we started it, and we were sending students to Africa and to other countries to work with organizations that were trying to better the situations in those countries.
Was there ever any doubt that the institute would get renamed for Terry Sanford after he stepped down?
There shouldn't have been any doubt about it. It was a natural thing. We were always looking for people to name things after who might help us raise money for those institutions. It would have been a disgrace if we hadn't named it for Terry Sanford. Duke became a much more well-known institution nationally and internationally because of Terry Sanford's leadership. His appointment as president of Duke was not obvious. Duke had never had a president who had been anything other than a prior university president. But it was largely because of the admiration that Mary Duke Siemens had for Terry Sanford. She had been, and at the time I think was still chairman of the board at Duke. She may still have been also the chairman of the board of the Duke Endowment. But she had worked very closely with Terry Sanford when he was governor, and she really took extraordinary liking to him, and admiration for him, and she was a major contributor to his campaign when he was running for governor and later for president of the United States. The point is, she was the living embodiment of the Duke legacy at Duke. She lived here in Durham, and everybody loved her, and she seemed to love everybody. And she's a really wonderful. I give her credit for my coming to Duke, because when I was asked to come here, I talked to two people after the offer was extended, and one of them was Mary Siemens, because I had worked with Mary when I was working with Terry in the governor's office, and I knew her and I knew her husband well, and I knew that if I came to Duke, that I would have an ear that was open to me if there were things that I wanted to talk about, which proved to be the case. But the long and the short of it was, if Mary had not been the chairman of the Duke board of trustees, Terry Sanford would never have been elected president of Duke, I don't think, because she is the one who waged the campaign. She saw that Terry Sanford had what it takes to be a president of a great university, and of course, she cared most of all about Duke University. If she hadn't felt that way, she wouldn't have supported Terry. But she was sure that Terry, and she was right when you think about the difference that Terry Sanford made. And it is still rare for universities to pick a politician to be the president of the institution. Whether it's right or wrong doesn't make any difference. That's the way it is. And people are happier or safer, feel safer if they've had people who've had analogous experience. But the long and the short of it was, anybody who knows anything about the situation here knows that but for Mary Duke Biddle Trent Siemens being in the position of influencing that decision, it never would have happened.
One of the major milestones for the school was becoming a school, which came out of a 2005 report and then officially was confirmed in 2009. Did you feel strongly that the institute should become a school?
The faculty wanted it. The faculty wanted it because of the prestige of being a school. The faculty wanted it because it would have facilitated the creation of a PhD program in public policy. I don't remember when the PhD program was started. I think it was started before the creation of the school, but was cemented by the creation of the school. Once I stopped being the director, I was simply not going to get involved in those questions. I liked the idea. I thought it was a great idea, but I didn't lift a finger to bring it about, because there were plenty of others who were much more directly involved in it than I was, and it was up to them to make that decision. So I liked the outcome, but as I say, I would have continued to be a supporter of the effort of what's now the Sanford School, whether it had been called a school or not.
When I read your original letter to Terry Sanford in 1970 describing what kind of thing you would create here, and I think about what the Sanford School is, I see an incredible parallels. It seems like your vision has really come to pass. Do you feel that way? Do you feel like what is here now is a true reflection of what it is you came here to try to create?
Absolutely, but as I say, maybe I'm a good prophet. I don't know. I just I did what I know how to do, I think, and if that led to this, so much the better. But one never knows. It would be claiming too much, saying that I predicted that this would come out this way. I certainly didn't. I felt in the process of doing it was always unsure about what would stick and what wouldn't stick, and it would, a lot of it had to do with the faculty members whom we recruited, and they made these decisions. I didn't make the decisions. I made some of the decisions at the beginning, but increasingly they made most of the decisions. And so the credit really belongs to them, and we've been fortunate, enormously fortunate with the faculty members that we had. Many of these people are still distinguished nationally and internationally in their fields. Many of them are superb scholars. Many of them are absolutely legendary teachers, and that goes on. And I can't help but exult in it, whether I had anything to do with it or not.
Finally, just to wrap us up, you wrote these reports for the Ford Foundation thinking about what public policy would do for government service. Do you think that it has done those things that you and other founders of the public policy movement thought that this kind of training and education would do?
I think there's a mixed record. I mean, in the sense that if you look at what we were encouraging people to do, there are plenty of people in government and in think tanks that focus on government who were all trained in the way in which the reports encouraged people to be trained. It is also the case that characteristically, some of them were people who went into government. They didn't understand the full lessons because they were so concentrated on numbers, on measurement. I think about McNamara and others who led the country into the war in Vietnam. They were embodiments of what we thought we were doing with respect to training people. So you think about the growth of right-wing foundations and businesses led by individuals who were become right-wingers. They picked up the numbers side of things, but they've not picked up the humanistic side of things. They don't think about the questions that we do focus on with respect to ethics and respect to humanities and others things. They've taken a very narrow understanding of this. That hasn't influenced so much the schools that are still doing things, but it has certainly influenced people who have that kind of training, but who don't have the ethics and humanistic side of the equation and are largely responsible for the success that Trump and others have had in leading the country in the wrong direction.
Thank you so much for your time, Joel. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you for your time, and I appreciate your interest.